Introduce the episode. Thanks so much. All right. Well, thank you once again for joining me, Pastor's Positive Health Institute. And I have another wonderful guest with nice little letter above your head there. I like how that works out. I got to figure that out. And so I'm really excited to have Megan Miessler. Is that how you pronounce it? Is that correct?
Miessler.
Miessler. See, I'm glad I asked. With us, speak with Lutheran Counseling Services, and what's great about it is that here's a biblical perspective to kind of help us. And so, but before we dive into the work that you're currently doing, I really just would like to hear more about you, just kind of your journey to become a director of Christian education first, and then now you're a licensed executive director, right, of Lutheran
Yep,
Counseling. Ooh, that's a big title. So that's
it is.
wonderful. Megan, just please tell us a little bit about yourself. And if you like this episode or you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe. And if there's anything you'd be interested in finding out about pastor and church worker health, please feel free to contact me about that. Okay, Megan, so tell me about your journey to becoming first a director of Christian education.
Well, it's probably a little backwards. So I grew up as a pastor's kid. My dad is an ordained minister. And so that was a journey in and of itself. It didn't, I am probably the pastor's kid you hear about because I'm the one who didn't really like being a pastor's kid. So I really was not intending on going into church work at all. I grew up in Florida. And so I was never going to leave Florida, which I haven't left Florida. So I did become a DCE without ever leaving Florida. Well, permanently leaving Florida. So yeah, I did a lot with the church like in my teenage years, and actually even in college, I went to University of Central Florida and I studied psychology. I had thought about church work some, but I mean, honestly, as a pastor's kid, I was pretty burned by the church, like just being authentic. And so I remember, this is a crazy story, but I remember my first dating experience in college. I dated a guy who was attending Assemblies of God church, and I called my dad and I was like, dude, what is going on? And he's like, I'm not going to tell you anything. Like, you can just look it up in the Bible. And I was like, okay. So he's kind of always somebody who pushed me to like get back into church at times. Through high school, I didn't like hearing my dad preach on Sunday morning. Like, you can't ground me for missing curfew and then I need to listen to your sermon. So he was a big proponent of me just making sure I was in church, but it didn't have to be his church. And I will always say that's what actually like allowed me to develop my own faith. And so I went and got a degree in psychology, but I was attending a church in Orlando, and they had an opportunity they needed a youth worker. And so I joined their team as like just a contract youth worker. And then as I was working on my master's in counseling, a pastor that I was working with, he was very sweet, but he was not a very good counselor. And so I did a lot of the premarital counseling there. And then when they kind of ran out of funding, another church picked me up to be a youth leader, and one of their requirements was that I did colloquy. So I actually did colloquy at St. Paul's. And I had already had some theology classes because Concordia was doing this thing where they called it House of Studies, and they did it in Orlando. I don't know if you ever heard of it. And so you could get a teaching degree at UCF and take all your theology courses like at this like evening kind of thing and become a called teacher again without ever leaving Florida. So that prepared me well, and I was a DCE for 8 years in this district, in the Florida Georgia district, while I got a master's in social work. So again, really backwards way of becoming a DCE.
Well, I went the colloquy path to be a pastor, so I understand.
Did you? Okay, there you go.
Yeah, I was. In fact, up until 6 years ago, I had no clue I was going to be a Lutheran pastor. So, but God has good plans. He knows how to work
He
things.
does. He does.
So that's great. So Florida, Georgia. So you were there with, let's see, who was the district president for a while? Was Greg Walton there for a while?
Yeah, Greg Walton has been the district president. President Michaels was here. Yeah, we've had some, and then President Rocky is here now.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah. So those who Dr. Greg Welton's on one of my first podcasts. So if anybody wants to check that out, he's with Grace Place Wellness now. And so I'm doing good work there. And I think he might have been the one that gave me your name. So
I think he was.
so you were a director of Christian education for, you said, what, 8 years?
Yep, 8 years.
And then now, how long have you been at Lutheran Counseling Services, and how did that come about?
So I've been here for 17 years. So there was like a gap in when you graduate with a master's in social work, if you want to become a licensed clinician, you have to get like 1,500 hours in doing counseling. So when I was at Trinity downtown in Orlando, they had a large, thriving school, and I really just saw a need for counselors in our private schools. So I had gotten a grant from Wheat Ridge, which is now We Raise, and started a school counseling program. So once that kind of took off, I went over to Lutheran Counseling Services full time. And we launched our school counseling program. So I started it for free at one little school, and now we're in 12 schools across the state of Florida. We put registered interns into private schools to just do counseling, not guidance or anything, but literally just mental health in schools. So I walked my path over there. My dad, when I was in high school, he'll tell you it was because I was a rough teenager, but he went and got a counseling degree. And he's helped start Lutheran Counseling Services a long time ago. And so he was the director when I came over. And then about 4 years ago, right before COVID hit, he retired and I took over for him. But he's still on the staff. So I'm his boss, which is the most beautiful thing. If you can ever be your father's boss, it's the most beautiful thing. So yeah, so it's been an interesting walk. Like you said, like God opens up doors. 10 years ago, I would have been like, no, I am not running a counseling center. Are you crazy? But 10 years ago, the world was a lot different. So
yeah. So you do work with schools. What kind of work do you do, maybe with your background too, growing up in the church, working in the church, and with your education, what kind of challenges have you seen maybe facing church workers and pastors?
Yeah, so we have some specific contracts with different districts. So we serve the Florida, Georgia, and the Southern District. We're also Pan-Lutheran, so we do serve the Florida Bahamas Synod and the ELCA. So church workers and their family members get up to 3 free counseling sessions with us. And that's something the districts and the synods pay for. And then we also work with Office of International Missions and do all their missionaries that are deployed. They get services with us. So, I mean, I think that one of the biggest things I see, and it's what I always tell as a pastor's kid too, is like we kind of forget that church workers are human. I mean, they deal with the same things we do every day, but they're so much placed on a pedestal at times. And I think it's really hard. I don't know that we create a great avenue for church workers to be authentic about their own health and their own walk. And so I think we almost set them up for failure, right? Sometimes when we do that. And so, we see depression, anxiety, addictions, burnout, grief and loss, I think is huge. And honestly, a lack of social support. I work a lot with probably, especially through the pandemic, I worked a lot with like single church workers. And there was such a depression and loneliness and grief and loss of just human interaction. That was a kind of a unique thing that we were seeing. And so, yeah, I think church workers deal with a lot of the same things we do while being put on a pedestal.
Yeah, it's interesting because studies will show that pastors have the worst mental health, second only to counselors. So there you go.
Yep. Welcome to the party.
Yeah. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that we as pastors celebrate the joys too, where a lot of time counselors just get all of the negative and all of the processes that they have to go through, and they don't get that necessarily joyful side of it too as well. And it's one of those things where, again, COVID accelerated isolation for sure. And also, I did my doctoral work in COVID. And so the pastors that I interviewed were in the midst of COVID, and it was a tough time. One was getting ready to quit until after I interviewed him and spent an hour and a half just looking at how church members actually are doing things. You just have to be aware and need to have the tools to look at it. So what do you think are the bigger contributions to, you mentioned anxiety, stress, burnout, What do you think? What do you think are the big contributors to those things?
I mean, I think two of the things I always ask church workers when I meet with them, one, have you taken a day off? I think we absolutely are horrible at taking a day off, which if we look at it, most people who are in the caring profession struggle with that a lot. Your to-do list is never done. It's so relationship based. There's always a need. And so if you're not really carving out time, and then what do you do when you do take time off, right? Is it spent filling up your cup and things that you enjoy? And the second thing I always ask church workers is like, who loves you and cares about you for you and not for the role that you're in? As a pastor's kid, I saw that so much. Like, yeah, people wanted to be with my family, but I didn't know if they were really my friends and like if they'd be around if we left or, I always say like, I want people who can sit next to me during a Lightning hockey game and love me as a Lightning hockey fan and not as Megan Miessler, DCE, and, executive director. And so, do you have people that love and care about you for you? Or is it just about the role that you're in? And I think those are two big contributing factors. The other one that's definitely emerging is sleep. I know it sounds kind of silly, but sleep is such a big indicator of your mental health. And so are you getting adequate rest for your body? And I think that's a big one too, because it can be our mind that prevents us from sleeping. My dad and I will often talk with church workers. One of the great things about the mental health profession is that you're encouraged to staff cases. I would love to see church workers have a place where they can staff cases or staff, crisis or trauma or difficulties in relationships. I don't think we've created a system where you can like process the things that you're experiencing with your church members, what that hits on for you, those type of things. I think if we could create almost like a staffing opportunity for church workers, it would be so helpful in a way that is just transformative and like reflective of what of your own stuff is hitting up against what this person is bringing to you.
Yeah. No, that's good. And you mentioned sleep. It's interesting because I know that Grace Place Wellness talks a lot about physical health as well as New Clergy Health Initiative has done a lot of studies. In fact, Dr. Regine Preschel Bell is, again, if people want to check it out, from Duke Clergy, is one that I've interviewed before. And just the studies of physical health connected to mental health, right? And how often pastors feel guilty for taking care of themselves. I like to call it steward care rather than self-care, because self-care, we get caught up in the word self. And so how are you stewarding yourself to be the best pastor that you or church worker that you can be? And sometimes, we feel guilty, like you said, we feel guilty for taking time to enjoy our hobbies or to fill up. And so what would be a strategy that maybe you would help a church worker or a pastor saying, hey, you need to take time for yourself? What would be something that you would recommend or to them that would help them actually do that?
Yeah, like when I first got into ministry, I had a great DCE that I followed, and he was really a mentor to me. And he taught me, I explain it horribly, right? But he taught me the block scheduling. Have you seen that? And I think that is a beautiful thing where you take 7 days a week and you split your days into 4-hour chunks and there's 4 of them. And so if you can't get a full day off, like if you can't take a full 24 hours off, are you really blocking out your day so that you're taking some blocks off? And my dad was like that growing up. Like if he had an evening meeting, would he not come in the morning? And I think too, like as leaders, right? Because DCEs, we talk about being second chair leaders. As leaders, you kind of set the tone of like, are we being healthy as a team in our congregation or in our leadership here? And so where are you taking time for yourself? I also work with some church workers on I'm a big bullet journal. I love my bullet journal. I am, so it's tracking the things that I need to do for me every day, but I look at it as a month, because our brain does this weird thing of like, man, if I've gone 3 days in a row and I haven't done what I know I needed for me, then I view myself as a failure. But if I look at it over a month and say, wow, 50% of this month I did okay, right? I can see that I am not such a failure, if that makes sense. So that's been a good tool. for me. And I love our system, and I don't know how it is for you, but down here, Florida, Georgia, they do circuit meetings. Some circuits are healthier than others.
Right.
But I think gathering with people that are in similar roles as you are, I know that's been helpful as a DCE. And I've seen that as pastors. I wish we would do that for, honestly, pastors' kids, but that would kind of get a little crazy. Yeah, I think that's a great tool as well to connect with people that are in similar roles as you.
You just gave me an idea for our camp here in the Sawtooth Mountains, a camp for church kids. That would be good. Okay. Anyway, that's a side note.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned a couple of really good things. I think the challenge, and maybe you could speak to this, is that often, and it's generational for sure, but often the pastoral role sets a tone, especially, again, sometimes they're solo pastors, and that's a whole different dynamic they have to deal with. But with those that have church workers underneath them, sometimes the pastors can set what I would consider an unrealistic tone of work expectations. They might say, "Hey, I don't expect you," but at the same time, they model something that looks different, and often unintentionally, they judge church workers for actually taking days off and not being there all the time. And it's hard for pastors to even take one day off. I really am a big proponent of how can you take 2 days off if possible. And again, here's the thing. As pastors and church workers, I don't know if we ever truly check out or turn it off. But at the same time, there you have to be intentional. Like my wife works Monday through Thursday, and so I like working Mondays. And so Friday and Saturday, we always try to say one of these days I am not going to go to the church. Even if it's for a minute, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, on the flip side, do I take my computer home with me, and am I doing stuff and reviewing stuff for the weekend all the time? But it's different than actually being at the church. And so again, we all find those things that schedule us. But what would you say to the pastor? We'll start with that, who says, yeah, I know that they need their time off, but really kind of looks down on, and I'm going to call it generational for a minute, because I see this gap. You have 50, 60-year-olds who just everything's about the church all the time as pastors. And they don't seem to value, again, unintentionally, these younger DCEs coming in actually needing to work only 50 hours a week. And I mean,
only, right?
Right. And a lot of times, I like what you said, a lot of times their ministry is in the evenings. And so how do you say, hey, don't come in till 1 if you're going to be here till 9 or 10? But yet we find, especially if there's schools involved, well, you got to go teach classes for the school in addition to this. So what would be, if you're talking to a pastor now who kind of has that reputation, what advice would you give that pastor?
Well, you probably haven't seen my full personality yet. So this is where I warn people that I'm a pastor's kid. So yeah. I don't hold anything back with pastors. I mean, honestly, I would challenge them and like, so what's your identity outside of this? When you retire, what's your life going to look like? Right. Because I think that's the difference generationally, is that everything you are, and I know some people like that, right? Everything you are is wrapped up in that title as pastor. And I think a younger generation is coming in and saying, like, that's not going to be everything I am. And so I think there's a lot of challenges in that way. But also, I think you have a generation coming in as a congregation after COVID saying, I don't know that I need somebody whose identity is fully wrapped up in this. Like, I'm looking for an authentic leader that can tell me, who they are as a person and what their struggles are too. So, I would say that you're really going to get uncomfortable when you bring in a younger generation as part of your leadership team, because they're going to be ready to challenge you on that. And they should be, because we've learned more about mental health, and we've learned more about, how much our identity can be tied into who we are and what we do. And really, I think we need to find value and worth in other places. We did another podcast recently, and my dad, Rick, he shared like what we are finding in church workers a lot is their faith is in their head And they have a really hard time of getting it down into their heart of, yeah, I know I'm not judged by what I do, but man, I've got to be a good pastor. And so that theology is a struggle sometimes to live out, I think. And so, yeah, I think a little bit gone are the days of proving your worth. And I think a younger generation in leadership is coming in and saying, I'm not going to do it that way. I mean, I love my father dearly, and I would never say anything that I don't say to his face. But it was the same way following him as an executive director. I have kids, and I function differently, and so I do this role differently. And thank goodness COVID came in and allowed me to. But it was going to be really hard to shake that up, following him as a leader as well. So yeah, I would say get ready to be uncomfortable and really challenge where your identity lies.
And that's tough. I've known several pastors who just can't retire,
Yeah.
or they've tried to retire, and because they don't have an identity. And again, I love preaching the word. I love pastoral ministry. I get it, but it is a challenge when that's where your identity is wrapped up in it. And so I find, and maybe you can comment on this. I find that they potentially, now there's two factors. We have a lack of pastors, so that drives them
Yeah.
to stay in the pulpit longer. But potentially they aren't actually serving the congregation well because they just don't have the energy like they used to. And again, that generational gap that you talked about. So I wonder, what would be some things you would encourage pastors who are looking towards retirement, who are wrapped up in that identity piece? What would you encourage them to start exploring or figuring out?
Well, I would say first, you don't all have to come to Florida because we see a lot of that. But I mean, find out where your other passions lie. I mean, I think there's a lot out there for interim ministry too. I've met pastors, I'm sure you have, that are great at preaching, or some that just hate it, right? Like there are things of pastoral ministry that you love and you enjoy, and other things that you don't. So I think you can find value and worth in exploring other opportunities for that. Man, my dad is sitting right in this, right? It was so interesting to watch him come out of parish ministry and then be in worship. And, he gets all uncomfortable, and for a long time, he didn't know what to do during Advent season or Lent. Like, it changes your routines and your lifestyle. So, I mean, I definitely would figure out, who are you outside of being a pastor? And I think that is hard. Like, I get it. Maybe you can't always take that hat off. I will say though, and you've said a couple of things, so I want to say this. One of the biggest things I learned transitioning from DCE to a counselor is the ability to not respond immediately, to let people figure things out. When I set a boundary for me and say, hey, I really can't meet with you till tomorrow, it's so crazy how what was an emergency yesterday is not an emergency anymore, because you kind of empowered them of like, I believe you can handle this, and let's meet tomorrow and see how you handled it. That was one of the most freeing things of coming out of ministry, is I didn't have that demand to think I had to respond immediately. And so, yeah, I would encourage pastors looking towards retirement to figure out who you are outside of your role in ministry. And you have a lot of gifts as a shepherd, as a teacher, that can be used in so many different ways. But the ability, as my pastor used to say, to take off the apron and put on the bib, I think is very powerful.
I always encourage pastors, even before retirement age, is to, find some hobbies that you will actually enjoy doing but the problem is now we feel guilty for enjoying those hobbies as pastors. Like I've been golfing with several pastors. I like to golf, and I had one pastor that was golfing. His man, I wish I could do this more. And he's elder. I mean, he's older, but I said, you're in town. Why can't you golf? I've seen you take phone calls on the golf course.
Yep.
And you could leave if you needed to. But there's that guilt that I'm not always at the office, available at the ready, like you just said. And I had one pastor friend who said, now not every case is this way when parishioners need help, but he said, your lack of planning doesn't constitute my emergency.
Right.
And so sometimes saying, okay, is this really an emergency? can I wait and let the Lord process things with you a little bit? Because part of the problem is that unfair expectation of pastors to fix things for people too, that we put on ourselves and that parishioners put on church workers. It's not our job all the time to
Right.
solve your problem. Now, we love walking through that process and we love helping you, but it's not our problem. Now, I want to flip that question, the church workers. So you have a pastor who is struggling with identity outside, and so he kind of works 24/7, which, we are on 24/7 to some degree. I get that. But now he's got a younger DCE that's coming in and who wants to say, hey, I need some boundaries here. But that could be a tough conversation. So how would you encourage that DCE to maybe broach that subject with a pastor who, again, doesn't necessarily say those expectations, but the way they work and what they model implies that expectation?
Yeah, so I do a lot of that with DCEs of like, how do you go back and talk to your pastor, right? I think it's really important, one, to understand who your pastor is. Pastors are human and they're all different types of communicators, right? And so understanding, like, does your pastor need time to process? Are they a good external processor? That's a valuable thing to understand about your pastor. And also, how does your pastor receive you? Let's be honest, if it's a female coming to a male versus a male coming to a male, those conversations are going to look different. And I had a pastor one time that I was like, hey, I'm going to get emotional when we talk. And that doesn't mean the things I'm saying aren't valid. And so I think there are times, if you know your pastor, don't blindside them. Be like, hey, I'd like to have a meeting and here are the things I'd like to talk about. We had a director at LCS who was a very introverted man, and he wanted an agenda 24 hours ahead of time so he could really think about the things that he wanted to talk about. So one, I would know who you're talking to, right? Like, know who that person is and the time that they need to process. But I think also coming from it, look, the younger generation isn't afraid of telling you what their diagnoses are, what they struggle with, what they need. And I think that's great. I think that that just shows you how far we've come in mental health, right? But it makes an older generation uncomfortable. I was speaking to a group of teachers, and I remember one teacher is like, I don't know why all these kids have to say they're anxious. Like they're just uncomfortable. Why do we have to use the word anxious? And my question back was like, why does the word anxious make you uncomfortable? Like, why are we so opposed to using that language? So I would be honest and share with them what you need. What is it that you need? What is it that you're experiencing? And what keeps you healthy? I think we work with missionaries before they go overseas, and that is language we put in place a lot of, before you get dropped in a new country where you're on 24/7, what are your healthy coping skills and how can you put them in place before you even get there? And so I think as long as you can share your story and who you are and what you need, I think people will be open to listening. Your immediate reaction that you get from your pastor might not be beautiful. Give them time to process.
Yeah, because the pastor's just a person.
Just a person. Yeah, a human.
Yeah, and you mentioned something very interesting because, so I was in a faith tradition before. I was an LCMS pastor that really rejected any sort of psychology. We'll call it that. Mm-hmm. Therapy. The Bible had enough. You didn't need anything else. And I remember counseling people because they would send people to me to counsel as a pastor on staff. And I remember often after a couple of times going, I don't have the tools for this. Right. You need some real help. And I used to always tell my senior pastor, I'm like, look, if I have a broken leg or if I can't stop coughing after a week and I have a fever, I'm going to a doctor who has studied this. And because again, I'm not saying we swallow all psychology whole because you got to sift through it, but there's certainly some benefit for those who have studied, triggers for certain trauma from when you were certain ages, marriages that are on second and third marriages. There's this baggage there that a lot of pastors aren't equipped to handle. And handle properly anyway. And so it is hard though. So I've presented 5 sessions in a all church workers conference at the Southern District. And what I present is front loaded with what I would say some uncomfortable psychological terms, because you have to kind of lay the groundwork of where the research is and why we're where we're at, that informs why we need to know, have that self-awareness, which is really, you said something for a DCE, be able to, identify, hey, like you said, hey, I'm going to be emotional. Doesn't mean it's not valid.
Right.
Well, a lot of people don't have that processing to go, well, I need to be able to understand who I am before I have this conversation. But I noticed this great disparity when presenting, to what you just said, that age gap, between, those who are over 50, who are like, I don't know how I feel about this, or I don't like it at all, to those who are maybe 30 to 50, or kind of, well, yeah, I kind of see that it's valid, but don't totally know how to process it. And I would say 35 or 30 on under, like, yes, bring it on.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'll come up to you and go, I was talking to my therapist last week. You're like,
Exactly.
so we do see this shift. I think it's positive. The challenge, though, I think, is that a lot of times pastors, when a younger person says, well, this is my diagnosis or whatever, they immediately go, well, don't use that as a crutch.
Yep.
Right. And so how would you help both church worker and pastor deal with that kind of, I said, misunderstanding between how those things play?
Yeah, I kind of I hear that all the time, right? Don't use that as a crutch. My son has autism. He's very high functioning, 17. He's going to go off to college. And as soon as he got that diagnosis, I was like, oh. But honestly, what I said was, oh, you're not a jerk. You just have autism. So it was like, okay, I know what this is moving forward. So I think for a lot of people, it's not about owning the diagnosis. It's about owning the treatment plan, right? It's about having a plan. So when I have anxiety, I take medicine for it. I know, like, when my body starts to ache, like, I know my anxiety is flaring up. So I understand myself better. So I think for this younger generation, it is not a crutch. It is a way to define and understand what my body is doing. And I'm a big fan too of ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences and understanding trauma and resiliency. And again, it's not a crutch. It's I'm more self-defined and I more understand myself. Not that I fully do. I'm working on it every day, but I think it has to be shared kind of a little bit more in that light. We've taught my son, as he goes in for interviews or whatever, to share that he is on the autism spectrum. And so his face doesn't change, and, he doesn't always recognize feelings until they're really huge. Which a lot of pastors have autism too, right? And so I think it is more of me understanding who I am and sharing with you who I am. And I think that's important. We do have, as a younger generation, I kind of fall in that middle gap. We do have to understand how to share it in a way that we're sharing it so that we can increase understanding, not so that we can make excuses. Mm-hmm. And so I think it probably is a little bit in the delivery at times of, how can I share this with you so that you understand me better and I can tell you what I need based on what I know about myself.
No, that's good. And I think, when I had seen a counselor for a while, it really helped me understand my defaults to certain stresses in my life, or why do I go this certain way? And again, raised in a really good home, but one of the things I lack is, well, there's two things. I feel like I have to control everything, and I'm a failure if things don't go right. And then secondly is I lack empathy because, I was raised to be very tough and suck it up.
Pull the bootstraps and let's go.
Don't cry. You're not going to die, so quit crying, right? And again, I'm very thankful for my parents. They raised me to know Jesus and provided very well. But there's some things that I default to that I didn't realize was impacted by this. And now that I know that, I go, okay, so this is where I go, and I need to, so I can surround myself with people to say, hey, I will try to do it all on my own. And so I need you to know that, and that will be detrimental if I do. So it's important, I think, that is good. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, and one of the things in my book that I wrote at the end, and in the last chapter, I'm talking about interpersonal relationship skills, and in the seminars I give, I cover this idea. Is it okay for pastors to have friends in the church? And it makes people
Ooh.
really, really, really uncomfortable. Seminaries will tell you you can't, and automatically you put a separation there. And like, I like what you said. I just want to sit next to somebody at a hockey game and see me as a fan. So how would you say that pastors and church workers can actually make that happen or be intentional? Because I think you have to be intentional about it to some degree.
Yeah.
So what would you say was the best strategy to get over maybe some of those hurdles that keep you from having friendships, if we can use that term, with church members?
Oh man, I think that's so hard. Because there has to, like, you have to go out on a limb a little bit, right? And let people know you. And so I've gotten burned a lot in life on that one. I think my parents have too. I think as you walk with people and you are authentic, like, I just love what you said too, of like, here are the things I know about myself and here are the things I do when, when stressors come in. Like, who do you share yourself with? So, I think one of the things in establishing friendships as a church worker, because we can have church workers that are in big towns, like I'm in Orlando, there's lots of people here. You can be friends with people that aren't in your church. That's easy. Then you go to like small town churches where everybody just knows who you are. And so how much are you like being authentic and putting yourself out there some, I think, is a big thing for me. And then, like, where are your common gifts? So I said, like, I'm a big hockey fan. We grew up in Tampa Bay. If you can sit next to me in a hockey game and not be offended, hey, then you can be my friend, right? And so I think there are some of those things of like finding commonalities and just allowing like your mask to come off. When I work with a lot of teachers, and it's that ability to like not project that everything's great all the time. Are you able to take down that mask and be authentic? And then it really does take trust. And honestly, and this is what stinks, is you never know if they really are your friend until you leave and if they still stay in touch with you. And I think that's the hardest part, but that can be true about friendships kind of anywhere. So there's always that risk taking in that. But for me, it's about, can you be authentic and can you find some commonality in that? I think those are powerful things.
No, that's good. One of the things that I always encourage pastors to do is find common things and actually just create opportunities to hang out with people,
Yeah.
and with no agenda. So again, hearkening back to previous experience, every meeting that we had, whether it was social or what, had to have this intense Bible study moment, and I found that just hang out with people and share life with them, and things will come up. And I really feel, and this is my experience, that when I know people, I minister better.
Mm-hmm.
When they know me, they listen better, because they
Yeah.
know where it's coming from. And then I have one pastor friend who has friends in the church. He goes, but sometimes he goes, I just have to go, hey, for this conversation, I'm putting my pastor hat on right now, just so you know. And the thing I like to mention to pastors anyway, specifically in church workers, but pastors, is like, my wife goes to my church. She's a member of my church. I'm her pastor. I'm also her husband. And so, how do those two work out? I'm not her pastor, in every circumstance.
Right.
And so, it does take work though. And it does take really some vulnerability. Now, I never encourage everybody just to go share everything with your life and but if they know, like one of the things you said at the beginning is that pastors are put on a pedestal, which can be very unhealthy. Because then your expectations, you're like you said, you're setting them up to fail because they will not meet your
Yep.
expectations. And every
No.
person's expectation of a pastor is different. And you don't know it's an expectation until they don't fulfill it. And then you're sorely disappointed. And because you're emotional, you can't sit there and pause and go, was this a realistic expectation? Probably not. Anyway, so I guess the thing I would encourage church workers and pastors is, just because you've been burned in the past doesn't mean that you don't still, go forward. God uses those relationships to build you and to build others too. So we have these challenges for church workers. How can church members help with those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I will just piggyback on what you said about the hat thing. I did a presentation where I literally was like, these are the amount of hats you wear. And
Yeah.
even with my dad right now, right? Like we'll
Mhm.
call and I'll be like, am I calling you as boss stuff? Are we talking parent stuff? Like,
Right.
identify the hat that they're wearing. I think that's super valuable. And I do think that's how you can help church workers in a lot of ways is identify the hat, check in on them. I mean, probably as a counselor, we get pulled into some of the more horrific pastor stories. And when pastors really get to those horrific places, they've been isolated for a really long time, and nobody's really caring about them as a human. And I think first and foremost, I think you have to care about your pastor and their families as a human. I'm a big proponent about caring about their families too, because it's not just the expectation that gets put on the pastor; it gets put on the wife, it gets put on the kids. It trickles down. And so, yeah, I would check in on them as a human. Check your expectations of your pastor. It can be so unrealistic, and you don't, like you said, you're not going to check it in the middle of you're already ticked at them and off on a big emotion, but kind of check it regularly of like, am I still viewing them as a human, or have I put them up on this pedestal in a lot of ways? They deal with everything that we deal with, and sometimes to a bigger extent, and that burnout is real. I would encourage people to ask the pastor, have they taken time off? Because for a congregation member to ask the pastor that, I think is a little bit more powerful at times. And so, yeah, care for them as one of God's children, because that is what they are. And they carry a heavy load.
Okay, so I usually don't do this, but I'm going to, because what you're saying
Ooh,
is, I know, yeah. I want to encourage any pastor, church leader, and if there's especially a church member listening to this. So I don't like to promote my own stuff, but a simple book called Affirmed, Building the Positive Mental Health of Your Pastor, walks through simple steps, and they're very practical. Just to say, can you check, just like you said, do you know your pastor's hobbies? Do you know what they like?
yep,
You know how, find out how exactly how they are. Because the work that I do is really preventative. And that's really what I'm trying to do. How can we get people pastors and church workers to pause and take the tools to really assess their week and say, okay, not everything was horrific. There was actually a lot of positive things. It's very subtle. You got to look for it. But they're there all the time. I mean,
yeah,
really, it's just but being aware of it, because we get so consumed with the trauma, and I mean, there's no other word for it, but just the
no, it's trauma. Hmm.
urgency of the trauma in the moment and the seasons that we do. And if we don't pause and take that, and if church members aren't really aware of these little things they can do, a simple thing like specific gratitude. You did this and that really means something to me. Or telling a pastor, you said this and that really impacted me this way. Not just
Yeah,
saying thanks for doing what you're doing. That's fine, but specific gratitude and specific care. Find out what they need and see how you can fulfill it, and then pray, obviously. And so you deal with a lot of obviously burnout. And I'm
hmm,
so thankful that you do that. And I know that. So is your dad Armstrong?
yeah.
Okay.
Rick
Okay.
Armstrong. Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So I know a guy. I mean, I've referred to a guy to him before. Anyway, and then he went to Shepherd's Canyon, and now he's doing. And I saw
Yep.
him this is in February, and he's doing fantastic. So because I presented in the Southern District, and he wanted to meet with me, and I'm like, yeah, you need.
But we have that
After
contract
you
in the
go through
Southern
this,
District.
then
Yeah.
you can
Yep.
implement what we just talked about. So I guess if there's something that you could tell pastors and church workers to help combat that negative mental health, what's a simple thing that you could say that they could start doing right now?
So what we talk about is a mental health check-in daily. And honestly, it has nothing to do with mental health. It's, are you sleeping 6 to 8 hours? And if you aren't, stop taking naps because you're throwing off your REM sleep, right? Are you eating, overeating, undereating? You really just need 3 meals a day. Are you raising your heart rate for 20 minutes? And have you spoken to somebody in this day that loves you and cares for you as you? So it's those four things, right? Eat, sleep, exercise, socialize. Like that is what your body needs. And that is one of the biggest proponents of mental health. The other thing too, and there's just a ton of research out there right now to combat trauma and build up resiliency, is use feelings words. Like use them. Say if you're, if you're feeling depressed today, or if you're anxious, or if you're happy, but really actually use feelings words, not just for you, but for the members in your congregation. If we can teach that emotional language, it helps so much with resiliency, for those who have walked through trauma and for you as well. So those would be my big things. Be authentic. I'm all about being authentic. I'm probably too authentic most days. But I think it goes a long way in the church and a long way for mental health.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think, one of the things you said there, well, several things, but obviously sleep, eating, exercise, those all inform where you're at mentally too.
Yep.
Because, and they do affect you mentally, obviously. But having someone that you've talked to that truly cares about you for you, I think that would be a challenge for a lot of pastors because how do I know? And you talk about using feeling terms, and I think for me, I learned not too long ago, actually, only about 5-6 years ago, that I'm a verbal processor, and I used to not be, and that would be to my detriment. And so, I learned to, when I'm talking with people, especially my wife, and I was, hey, right now I just need to verbal process this, and so
Yep.
it's open for you to say, well, why is that? Why is that? And I found that what's really important, hey, I feel this way, for someone to say, so tell me, why do you think you feel that way? Because a feeling is, sometimes you need to know the root of the feeling. And a lot of times I don't know. I just feel this way. And you deal that when you're dealing with trauma, especially with younger people, they react certain ways and they feel that way. And you have to find out, well, here's something that happened and that's your default now.
Yep.
And you need to know that, right? So again, using psychology terms for people to get uncomfortable with, but there you go.
Uncomfortable is a feeling. I love it. It's probably my most
and
go-to.
I like how you said, why are you uncomfortable with people feeling anxious?
Right.
And the tradition I was in before would say, well, it says be anxious for nothing, so now you're sinning. So I said, why did Paul address it if he didn't know it was going to be an issue and people needed the answer? It's like, it's a battle, right? Make your petitions known and the peace of God, but have a friend who could share those petitions with you and carry those burdens together is really, really important. So if somebody's listening to this, they're like, wow, I really think that I would like to know how to get in touch with Lutheran Counseling Services. Who do you service? What's your scope? Is it everyone, everywhere? And how would they get in contact with you to find out how they could be helped by you?
Yeah, so we are licensed therapists in the state of Florida. Because of the calls that we receive, I'll play it diplomatically correct. We can go across state lines pastorally. And so you can reach out to us at LCS, like Lutheran Counseling Services, flforflorida.com. And if we can't service you, we're happy to connect you with somebody in your state. We have lots of connections throughout the state. But we have a podcast too. It's called It's Okay to Not Be Okay. It's very authentic, maybe too authentic, not meant to offend, but it can get a little racy at times. But yeah, so and we do, workshops and educational pieces, but definitely first touch would be our website or on social media, Lutheran Counseling Services. And so, yeah, I love to connect with church workers, especially in the education. Big fan of working with teachers too. I think they're one of our biggest church worker populations. And so, yeah, so I would love to connect with anybody, but thanks for this opportunity. I really have enjoyed speaking with you, and whenever you want to connect.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I'll put all of that information in the comments, and so people can check it out. And so, one thing I want to encourage the listeners is that, we do what we do because we love people and God loves people. And we want to see that the church is working together. When everyone's doing their part, they're building one another up in love and helping churches flourish, so that we can continue to promote the good news of Jesus Christ for all. So again, thanks again, Megan. I appreciate it so much. Keep up the good work, and hope to talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you so much.